The Metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to become the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing this promise to life. Join thought leaders Matthew Canterman, CFA, the Director of Research at Ball Metaverse Research Partners, and Jonathan Raz-Friedman, founder and CEO of Super Social, as they interview the brilliant minds building, shaping, and investing in the Metaverse.
Welcome to episode 14 of Into the Metaverse. Joining us today is Jonathan Stringfield, PhD from Activision Blizzard, to dive into all things gaming, marketing, and the Metaverse. Jonathan is currently the VP of Global Business, Research and Marketing at Activision Blizzard. Previously, he was Director of US Marketing, Insights, and Analytics at Twitter, a Manager of Measurement Solution at Facebook, and before that was at Nielsen for 6 years, because of course, everyone with measurement starts at Nielsen probably. Jonathan also holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he also has a really exciting book upcoming, which I'm sure he's going to talk about in today's episode. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
So before we dive in, we just have a short announcement to share with our audience. Okay, so Jonathan, diving into it, our favorite first question, as you might have seen for yourself listening to our podcast, that we like to pose to all of our guests. In your view, just what is the Metaverse? How do you define the Metaverse? And maybe what's more importantly, or no less important, is what the Metaverse is not, and how does a company like Activision Blizzard broadly see the Metaverse? So feel free to chop these kind of three questions one by one.
Yeah, for sure. So first, I'll start with the caveat that, given where we are at Activision Blizzard, I can't speak to official positions or anything about that. So anything that I say about Metaverse, the broader industry, gaming, what have you, my opinion solely, for better or worse, I'm sorry, or you're welcome in advance, depending on your POV on that.
Excellent disclosure.
Of course. And then, again, as we, think about the Metaverse, again, indeed, fan of the show, watched a lot of it, seen a lot of really smart people bring out a lot of really great definitions. So what I don't want to do is kind of retread ground there. And, we'll get less into like specific features and things like that, when we think about, or when I think about what the vision of the Metaverse is, like, I think we're kind of broadly aligned with the fact that we're still at the idea phase, right? So it's not a thing, it's something that we are building towards, thinking about, however you want to look at that. And I promise this is the most academic I'm going to get, and we'll get out of this territory momentarily. So if we adopt that POV, right, and we think about it as a bit of a practice, a project, a technology project, that when I think about the Metaverse, I see it as a bit of a praxis towards increasing our thinking towards how individuals may integrate into virtual worlds. And I think through that definition, like, now it kind of gets to all sorts of interesting lenses we can apply. And certainly things like gaming are included in that. And obviously I'm super biased about the role there. But again, also thinking about how people integrate into it and not just the technology components. And, how we might think about, even entities outside of gaming can get involved with it, all with the idea of thinking about how we as humans, as real people, operate in virtual worlds, and in doing so, maybe even kind of make them real. So, all right, that was about as academic as I'll get on that end, but that's kind of where I land on that. So that's what it is to me. And then what it isn't is, right, a lot of, unfortunately, what we talk about when we talk about Metaverse more broadly, that, again, I think it's increasingly kind of getting to that word soup where it's like, let's throw a bunch of terms and, new technologies and whatnot, because again, it's all broadly this idea about the future of the internet. So, I get it. People are kind of interested in, pushing a lot into that. But I think that only kind of confuses matter, both for the Metaverse and then also adjacent projects, which, again, as we've kind of talked about before, this is where I always kind of get on my stump and make that strong distinction that, Metaverse and Web3, which are consistently deflated in my mind, are very separate, particularly when we think about, the definition that I put out there in terms of it being a bit of a praxis.
I think you hit it right on the head. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. We had Neil Stevenson on recently discussing with us, when everyone thinks the metaverse, they think of Neil Stevenson, they think of Snow Crash because he came up with the term. And, even he's like, I couldn't imagine what we have today. When I envisaged the metaverse, I thought it had to be a headset because that was the only way I could envisage ever having that sort of fidelity. But go play a video game, and that feels like what he was thinking of in the first place. And so I totally agree with you that we have to, whether people think the metaverse is a VR experience, whether they think it's a blockchain, whether they think whatever, we need to step back and just, not be so definitive about what this thing is right now because it's so early.
And one more thing, which was also interesting to observe over the past 12 months, even 24 months, and to that extent, it's great that we're in a stage now where there's kind of decline a bit of the hype. People talk less about NFTs. I think it's going to give time for all of those different ideas, sense of ownership, sense of identity, metaverse, Web3 technologies to kind of take their course in a bit more quiet mode. We'll see how long that remains. But I think what is really clear is that this convoluting connection between all of these concepts together not only are not doing justice to any of them, but are also confusing from what the real purpose of what a metaverse is and what it can actually enable humans. And I know, Jonathan, with your background in sociology, and is something that at the end of the day, that is what important. What is the metaverse actually going to do for people? How is it going to touch everyday human life? And why would billions of people around the world are going to care about it over the next 10, 20 years? I think these are the key questions that at the end of the day are going to make or break a metaverse once it emerges.
100%. And also all of the other technologies that we're throwing in there, right? So again, when I'm saying that like metaverse and Web3 are separate, like, let's be clear, I'm not like dismissing Web3. I'm just saying stop smashing them together, because to your point, you're doing neither credit at that point. And again, like, sure, there's overlap, right? And like, we can talk about all the important things about digital ownership and how's that going to shape up, right? And a lot of folks, you'll find differing opinions, but a lot of folks believe that that'll have connectivity to Web3. And okay, that's kind of interesting to talk about. And some of the ethos around Web3, even, like, I can totally get behind in terms of how it could apply to Metaverse, right? So funding mechanisms outside of the standard VC model, particularly when there are mechanisms to push funding into groups or communities that might be excluded from VCs. Like, awesome, I'm on board for that, right? That as a means for innovation is great. And then, again, the whole concept of community-based building, like, also cool, but then also this is where I'm going to put the yellow flag up, right? That, if you're a techie kind of person, right, and you build a community around a project, and they're also techie people, and you're all building it for one another, like, yes, like, that's kind of a nice democratic process, but also, like, techie people, we're all techie people on this, probably techie people are listening to your show, we're not normal. We aren't like the standard consumer. So like you almost have that danger of kind of getting into an echo chamber there. So I think even then that's at its best. And then at its worst, again, it kind of pulls thinking intrinsically when we think about the metaverse away from people, because again, a lot of the standard Web3 project is to eliminate much of the human element. And that in my mind is a miss because again, both from like my perspective in terms of how we talk about gaming, addressing gaming, things of that nature, but then also just broadly as a technology researcher, as I've done work on social media before, now in gaming and increasingly on the metaverse, these are obviously technology problems and there's a lot of very smart people that are addressing them. But my expertise and where I try to address it is looking at the people problem, right? Like, how do we as individuals comport and move our identity through these different portals? Where are we getting value? Where are we not? Where does it make sense for our lives? Where does it not? And if, again, we're kind of combining these things, then there's probably a world where there's going to be less room for really interrogating those questions and therefore making just kind of a lousy experience for people as a result.
I think that's a really important subject to touch on, I'm financial. I want to go all into the numbers and finances. But before we get there, because I know it's something you've written on, just as a social movement, and this is kind of where your expertise really is just how much of consumer behavior is really driving this push to the metaverse, how digital technologies are playing a bigger role in our lives. I just think the metaverse is a natural extension of that. I know, Yon, this is something you've been very passionate about. This is, partly why you started a company, is because you realized how deep of connections people can build in digital worlds. And I think that whatever the metaverse ends up looking like when we get there, it's going to be driven by human behavior and human connections and social connections. And it's not going to be driven by VC dollars.
So I think looking at it through the lens of, social movement is interesting because, again, broadly, as we think about where are we seeing that kind of momentum in this kind of like broader areas that we think about what the metaverse is, it realistically is in gaming, right? And this is where, I wrote an article for VentureBeat that was out this past weekend and kind of poked the bear a little bit where, I kind of noted that on the trajectory that we are now, what we're seeing is that the critical mass of users that are adopting technologies that we're broadly considering either like metaverse-esque or contributing towards or moving towards the metaverse, it really is on large gaming platforms. And the reasons for that is that, gaming fulfills very basic human needs and intrinsic rewards. And then moreover, there's just something for folks to do there that like really kind of draws them in. So, as I think about what's most important in terms of those social factors, like, again, my biases have been on the table since the start of the conversation, but gaming is really kind of the important place for us to look at, given that there is already some 50 years of history and ongoing huge critical mass of users that are forming real connections and comporting their identities and themselves to complex 3D environments and learning how to navigate them. And, again, look, if you're looking to build that type of stuff in the future, like, that seems like a really good place to start to understand how these things work and how we as humans tend to interact in those areas.
I mean, let's just continue talking the book. Activision Blizzard has 400 million or so monthly active users across the platforms, across, Candy Crush and World of Warcraft and Call of Duty. So, I mean, there's not many large platforms out there unless you're talking about like Facebook Blue app, Instagram, it's TikTok that are much bigger than that. So exactly to your point, where people are engaging and where they're spending the time is in games today. And, I like to use the term, and my boss, Matthew Ball, likes to use the term proto-metaverse experiences. I think all of these kind of proto-metaverse gaming experiences are the best example of at least what we can imagine the metaverse to look like at some point. But one thing you did hit on, and in just kind of dovetailing with the fact that this is evolving from gaming, which I think is something that is interesting. We've talked about this with lots of previous guests, with Mark Petit, with Ryan Gill from Crucible, how the metaverse is like the internet built by web developers. It's still one of my favorite quotes that we've heard on the show. I'm sorry, the internet built by game developers, excuse me. But we have seen a lot of dollars of capital going into the sector, more so than we've ever seen in the past. And I know this is something you've also written about, I believe, on your Substack. I was reading it where you talked about, because there's so much capital chasing this, is this actually going to help us get to where we want to be in developing the metaverse through gaming? Or, I made the joke with Tim O'Reilly on our last episode that, Web3 is becoming Web A16Z because they're controlling so much of it with all the venture funding they're plowing in. Is something similar going to happen with the metaverse and gaming, where because we're getting controlled by so many of these VCs and these funds, that inevitably shapes the end product and we kind of lose sight of what we're looking towards?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's two answers that come to mind, right? So is an influx of VC money going to help development of gaming, drive innovation in gaming, metaverse opportunities driving innovation in metaverse? Yes. Is it going to be a lot of stuff that's warmed over versions of what we've done before? Also, yes, right? So I think it's one of these things where, like, sure, we're creating more surface area, but the broad problem we have is that there has been kind of this implicit pushback on really kind of tackling, thinking about interrogating concepts that have existed in virtual worlds. And of course, I'm going to point to gaming, but also like Second Life, anything else before that, right? And that's a problem because, again, we keep kind of starting from square one seemingly over and over and over, and it providing, not a ton of benefit towards these builds. So the closest, analog I have, and here's where I'll put in the opportune plug for the book, right? So get in the game, how to up-level your business with, games, esports, and the future of technology. It's out in a couple weeks, July 26th, wherever books are sold. And again, I wrote it as a mechanism to introduce advertisers to this world, because again, you're talking about all the opportunities and the millions of people, billions worldwide in gaming. And when I talk with advertisers, brands, marketers, technologists, they're all confused about how to get in there, right? And what's the right way to do so, or the paths to do so. So I wrote the book as a map for that, because like realistically, there isn't a lot of background there. But then moreover, when you have like brands forming technology practices and now like, or gaming and technology practices, and now applying them to Metaverse as well. And what we're finding is that here too, there's kind of that, potential that we're not interrogating and thinking about and building our knowledge set around gaming more fundamentally. So I wrote the book as a means to kind of up-level that, but then also structured it such that like, look, you're going to potentially get two benefits here. One, how to operate in like these proto-metaverse opportunities. And again, I like that term too. And like, there's a lot to be done there. But then in doing so, again, consistent with like, a lot of my themes and POVs that we've been talking about here, it will up-level your skills in terms of like what experiences do or do not fit with the psychological processes that we have when we are in immersive environments. And that is the single seminal skill that I believe marketers, and to a certain degree, technologists, business decision makers, what have you, will need to hone in future years, because that's where so much of this is heading, whether it's just through gaming or Metaverse or anything in between.
That's a really great point to build on. One thing that I feel is really fundamental in the moment, Jonathan, that I think worth unpacking, which is that this sort of direct analogy that people make. Oh, gaming, the Metaverse is basically going to be just gaming, just at a global scale. I really push back on that, not just because I'm a gamer, but also I'm building games. I just don't subscribe to the worldview that the Metaverse is going to be a place where you come to play games. I think the Metaverse is ultimately a place that focuses on three things, which, by the way, already happening. They're just happening at a non-3D way. And that is exploration. We explore the internet every day. The second thing is connection. We connect on the internet every day, right? There are platforms that have changed the world, that have brought people together, for good or bad, right? That's always the case. It's a double-edged sword. So we're talking about exploration. We're talking about connection. And then the third piece, which in my mind is one of the most prevalent topics about the Metaverse that is not being addressed enough, even though people do talk about it, which is the expression piece. And when you look at the fact that on Roblox, for example, 1 out of 5 daily users changes their avatar outfit every day, let alone that we're talking about something like 10 million people in a certain generation that doing this every single day, that human behavior, to me, what does it mean for me to be human in a world that is real-time 3D? To me, that is one of the biggest promises of the Metaverse. And what does that mean for human expression and human connection? And so my question to you, because of the world you're coming from, what do you believe that next level modality of human connection and human expression in the Metaverse, what do you think this is going to mean for advertisers, marketers, etc.?
I mean, it's a fundamental reorganization in terms of, one, how we think about messaging, but then more broadly, even how we think about media consumption, right? Because all of the ways in which, if we look at just the advertising industry for just a moment, the decades, years, lots of expertise in terms of really thinking about, I'm sitting at this screen and I'm consuming a given piece of content, and this is how I'm thinking about it, and these are the behaviors around, so on and so forth, etc. Right? Done ad nauseum, multiple research techniques, all wonderful ways that, I could bore the heck out of both of you, and will decline to do so right now, right? So we take that framework, and now we're looking at something that is conceivably fundamentally different. And how do we start to apply, or not, the learnings that we have from this more kind of passive screen as differentiated, when it's something where the screen is more kind of integrated into the overall experience. So what I think we'll find, and when I go out and, do talks with advertisers and to the communities and whatnot, I always try to highlight to folks that, we're looking at a world where, yes, it's virtual worlds, but like, one, we learn a lot about ourselves from them, but then also a lot of who we are as people gets applied to it. So I like to talk about the corrupted blood incident in World of Warcraft and how epidemiologists use that to understand the social factors of disease transmission, right? I talk about the Proteus effect, as talked about by Nick Yee, and how that is us carrying our human biases into virtual worlds. So there's all of a sudden all these, kind of deeper levels that we need to understand that, yes, we're humans, but how we behave is moderated by the technological factors, but our overall behaviors are a little bit slow. And, the point that I was kind of hit on the head here is that, like, again, when I wrote my dissertation, it was on social media and identity and what have you. And it's long and it's thick and you don't need to read it. So what the headline to it is that, end of the day, we are as authentic on social media as we interpret others to be, more or less. Tons of nuance to it, right? But like that's kind of the headline. So if that's the truism we have there, and that all of a sudden now we're thinking about like through a prisoner's dilemma, or maybe even a little bit of a death spiral of authenticity in social media, as we all kind of get like more and more fabricated and what have you. What does that mean when we look at how we're presenting ourselves in virtual worlds when, again, the idea isn't perhaps to associate my present self, myself as verified as identity, as determined by the state or the sovereign nations or however you want to start, because we can go down a long path there, versus my game tag, my ID in VR chat, my web handle, and so on and so forth. And to a certain degree, it's kind of like going back a little bit to those early days of the internet, which was highly anonymized and like always kind of like, yes, tinged on human behavior, but human behavior is filtered through more anonymity. But now anonymity that is, I guess, a little bit more interactive and immersive at this point.
I'm taking it all in because it's quite, it's obviously deep, and as you said, it's a whole dissertation, but it's very interesting. And we could probably spend hours. We've said this with our guests, talking about identity in the metaverse and what that means. And Yon, you've made the point several times that people might have multiple identities in the metaverse. There'll be work Yon, there'll be play Yon, there'll be, but even different plays. There'll be play with your friends versus play with your niece, for example. And so there's lots of different yous that can exist in how you portray yourself when you change your clothes to your avatar. So the whole concept of identity is shaping and twisting. And I don't necessarily know what we think the end game is, but I think we do know that, at least the way that I think about it, is that, if the metaverse is the internet built by game developers and everything is kind of gamified, it's going to be much easier for users to, both shape who they are, but also control who they are, because you'll be able to vote with your feet a lot better. If we reach this, dream scenario of interconnectedness and interoperability, but more importantly, I ask people this: have you ever played a bad video game for more than like 10 minutes? Or do you just turn it, like if it was bad, you just don't play it? And it's kind of the same concept. If, it's easy to get sucked into Facebook because everyone's there and it's just, it's easy to doom scroll, but it's going to be a lot harder when you actually have to navigate through a world. And so I think from that perspective, when I think about the metaverse and I think about where my identity goes and how I control it, I actually start to think that people are going to have more control, regardless of the technology choice. And this goes back to Web3 versus traditional technologies, but just how we kind of shape ourselves and who we are, where we go. I think people are going to be able to better control themselves.
And importantly, like that concept that you're talking about multiple identities, and this is me in this context, this is me in this context, that's actually something that, I've talked about. And again, one more time, biasing towards the academic in, some of my background studies, that there's this concept of foci and how here's my work self when I'm at the office, here's my home self when I'm at home, right? There's the Goffmanian conception of like, hi, this is my front stage, i.e. what you all get to see, versus my backstage identity is when I'm like offline from social media or from social interactions. And the impressive thing, or the important thing that we need to keep in mind, both those theories predate the commercial internet by 40 to 60 years. So like none of this is new per se, right? However, the more that we interrogate that person problem and how we, again, as humans, tend to be fairly static in our social behaviors, just mediated through a technological window, I think that is really a lens to kind of open up our thinking to, again, make those experiences that are going to be that much more comfortable and interesting for us.
And I think to some extent, this is why it might be that many people are struggling with understanding, like, wait, so what is this metaverse about? Because what you just described, Jonathan, it's actually not that different from what's been happening until today, right? When you talk about exploration, connection, human endeavor. I mean, we had this conversation with Tim O'Reilly in the previous episode that we've released, which was really exciting. And we were talking about, we're kind of recording on Zoom, And team was, we are in the metaverse now to some extent, right? This is kind of for me a metaverse because it's a point of time where we get together as people inside a virtual space. We're not physically. We can see that we are in a physical space, but who knows? Maybe it's not a physical space, but inside the Zoom, it happens in a virtual setup. And so I think what is really important, and I think this is also for marketers and advertisers and business people in general to recognize that it may well be that the metaverse is not going to be such a revolution. It's going to be an evolution of what we already know, because I have a feeling that a lot of people are waiting for that sort of this magical moment in time where like, okay, everyone, the metaverse has arrived. It's not going to be like that. And this is what the internet was like as well. We had, it was incredibly frustrating. And then we have the AOL, and then we had Yahoo, and then Google arrived, and then Amazon, and kind of slowly, boom, suddenly you have YouTube, and you have Instagram, and you have Snapchat, and look where we are today, right? Where everything is just completely accessible from a small piece of computer. And, I believe, and we talked about that on the podcast as well, I believe that the metaverse is going to be very much of that nature of evolution. However, the type of things we can do, it's really hard to judge today or try and conceive today, what are we going to do and what does it mean for people and businesses, because there is a paradigm shift with the metaverse, which is that it's actually going to be slightly different. It's going to be mostly in 3D or even real-time 3D. And what does all that mean for exploration, connection, human expression? What does it mean for work? What does it mean for doing business together? And these are the things that are going to really take time, because we're just going to need to see the technology continues to evolve, and we're going to need to see thousands of different use cases on every Amazon that was born and survived and grown in post the .com. There has been thousands of companies that have tried to do what Amazon has tried. And not only this is kind of an incredible boon of like for people like Jeff Bezos and his team for making it happen and building Amazon to what it is today. But I think people also forget Amazon was not alone. There was thousands of companies that have tried to do what Amazon have done. And I think this is where I feel like we are at the moment. We're like in this incredible gold rush. There are thousands of different things and everyone kind of thinks of them as metaverse. And you know what? To some extent, it's probably right. I made the point where today, if you're building something that has anything to do with quote unquote the metaverse, you should be calling yourself a metaverse company, because in the early days of the internet, everyone called himself an internet company. No one was a social media company or an e-commerce company or a, payments company. Everything was internet. And I think that's the stage we're at with the metaverse. And I believe it will still take 5, 10, 15, maybe even more years until we really get to a place of maturity where we can really see those use cases coming to life.
And the trigger point is always going to be anyone's guess, right? And, again, when you noted like that, all of a sudden we're expecting a switch to flip and, hey, we're in the metaverse and what have you. Even the early commercial internet, right? There was this moment that was called the Eternal September. I think it was like 1993, don't quote me on the year. And it was, basically when AOL blanketed the US with those trial CDs that have become so ubiquitous. I think most of you are probably old enough to remember those. Maybe some of your listeners not. But so the CD is a thing that carries data that you put in your computer and you can install things, right? But what happened is that it really kind of put a shot in the arm into the consumer internet. And then again, patterns repeating, right? What happened is that all of the old school kind of crusty IRC chat folks that were like the early web people, they termed it the Eternal September because they were like, oh, our internet is gone forever. Like now all these newbies and whatnot are coming in, they're going to ruin the culture and whatnot. And again, whether or not that happens up for debate, but obviously you could probably say universally good that folks are on board there. And it kind of reminds me of when I first, heard this concept of the metaverse and what have you, even outside of my, professional work and academic work and what have you, my kind of first reaction, because I was listening to it, was okay, so this just sounds like a lot of gaming with some social media stuff on here. I had that same crusty IRC guy reaction. I was oh, get off my lawn. What the heck? But then, as we're moving things forward, it's okay, a little bit more nuanced, that a little bit more interesting. Yes, potentially we are looking at what could be a more fundamental shift in terms of how we orient ourselves to the internet.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I one more Yonism. I like to pull up my Yonisms every now and again. But remember earlier this season, you said that, when your wife or when the average person accesses the metaverse, it's just going to be the internet to them. Like they're not going to call it the metaverse because it's just going to be the internet. And that's just how they're going to view it. And I like that because it kind of helps to ground what we're thinking.
It's us, the geeks, who are going to look back and say, oh, this is what we talked about like 10 years ago on the podcast and Neil Stephenson's book from like 40 years ago. And then the rest of the world, including my, 12 months old baby, who is probably going to be 10 by then, they're going to be like, Dad, you're really geeking out here. It's just the internet.
Shut up, Dad. You don't know what you're talking about. Like, oh yeah, we predicted all that, and vision in hindsight's 2020, and yeah, it'll be funny to look back. That's for sure.
I did want to go back to kind of talking about advertising, because I know it's a place where you spend a lot of your work and everything. And, in the digital ad tech space, we just saw a big merger announced, Unity and IronSource. Unity is obviously a company that many people talk about as kind of one of the key companies for building the metaverse with real-time 3D engine. There's not many companies that have that technology, which I and many others think is one of the core technologies that's going to help, take us to the metaverse and what we think of it. But, no one really talks about user acquisition and what, how do we get people in? And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, these companies that are trying to build the infrastructure for the metaverse. If you've thought about what the marketing infrastructure for the metaverse looks like. I think you alluded to it in the sense of kind of these theoretical, these academic principles that are applicable, but have you thought about more, in terms of, how it's going to be applied to these types of experiences explicitly?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So, I mean, part of it is like there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg or cart before the horse or some other truism that we want to apply here in terms of, are these consolidations, these purchases happening for the purpose of preparing for the metaverse? Maybe. Are they preparing for and or capitalizing on the opportunity in gaming right now? Yes. And I think, again, not too dissimilar from when I was talking before about, like, as I'm walking advertisers through what the opportunities are here in the book, it's, again, near term, you're going to get a lot of, value out of this if you learn how to do this well, and then you're preparing for the future. So I think, again, where I put my, like, VC hat on or mergers hat, like, that's what a lot of these feel like to me, right? That's like, okay, there's some real near-term ROI and a really interesting and salient business opportunity I can address now. And then it really sets me up for all sorts of exciting, interesting future directions, right? And then, as we're thinking about, like, what does digital marketing look like in that world? And, again, like, if you look at, how folks are kind of orienting advertising in, like, 3D gaming environments and whatnot, it's, like, still very early days, right? Because I think we're still at a point where, wrapping our head around what is something that can be useful and permissible in these worlds versus not is still kind of new. And I think a lot of folks are doing really good work to try to, to these things out. How effective is it from an advertiser POV? So again, my background in advertising is largely in measurement science, going back all the way to Nielsen. So like, again, it's not just that we're doing a cool activation here, or we're having like, we're building a store in some, virtual platform or what have you. End of the day, the CMOs, or more accurately, the CEOs, are going to start asking like, hey, we spent a lot of time and money doing this thing. What did I get for that? And they're going to need a really good answer. So I think things that are going to go hand in hand is, yes, understanding, as we talked about before, like all the psychological processes that we have when we are consuming information, how that's going to shift in these kind of virtual worlds. But then on the other hand, make sure that we're understanding not only what is the payoff for the consumer, because hopefully that should be fairly, obvious in terms of it not being a experience or whatnot that they're rejecting or what have you, but then also what's the payoff for the potential brand, the advertiser, or what have you, because unless we can solve for both of those while keeping in mind the developer, the studio, however that's creating the world, and making sure that this is a seamless experience for them, making sure that that triad of value, so to speak, is in place, that's where we're going to see a lot of momentum. And again, I think these technology platforms are really kind of maybe putting a bit of a shot in the arm in terms of accelerating our thinking, and at least getting the technological back end in place so we can start to do some of that experimentation.
Yeah, exactly. And, I was just looking at some of these, experiences. What's cool about Roblox is like you can actually like see like how many people went into these branded experiences, and you with the badges you can actually see unique users versus like total visits. 28 million visits in Gucci Town as of a couple days ago, and like 7-8 million unique visitors. So there's a lot of people, but exactly to your point, what am I getting out of this? If you're the CEO, like, what's the value of that 28 million, probably kids visiting my experience in Roblox?
I mean, so I was early on at Facebook, right? And so when I joined there, we were still in a world where everyone was counting likes. Like, y'all remember that day? Like that was like the big ROI. Like, brands had like thermometers. It's like how many likes we got. And in building the measurement science team there, one of the first things they had to do was like, sure, substantiate that there was value to that, but then also like behind the scenes kind of get brands away from focusing on that, because like, yes, you can ostensibly get a lot of people to look at something, but what is the actual impact, right? Like, how do we actually tie this to real world outcomes? And then again, something that we could easily go down like quite a deep hole on, what do we mean by real world outcomes? Like, yes, like if I put an ad for shampoo in Roblox, or I make like a Chipotle store, which, certainly there's precedent of that, is it driving, sales in store? Is it driving people to go to a Chipotle? And, again, they may have differential answers for that. But then when we're also trying to, whether it's user acquisition, as you mentioned before, or buying digital goods or what have you, where there's a little bit more real-time feedback, how is that going to look? And how are we putting that infrastructure in such that you can track that and understand, not from kind of a surveillance POV, though unfortunately these things do tend to go a little bit hand in hand in a scary way, but from a way in terms of understanding that, yes, if I advertise my digital MacGuffin, right, that I want to sell, now all of a sudden, I know how many of them I sold by merit of the people that passed by this billboard or activation or virtual store or whatever that manifests as.
Yeah, and I mean, on the value piece, right, I think that at least as someone who has been talking to and collaborating with a lot of brands, I think it's also about, we are in a very, very nascent stage of brands learning what is important for them. Just like in the early days of the likes on Facebook, everyone wanted the page on Facebook and they were chasing likes, and then they asked, okay, now what? And I think now to a large extent, this is what's happening, right? A lot of brands are kind of, we just want something on the platform, on Roblox. And I think slowly, the KPIs, the measurement, what exactly it means for us, what are we trying to accomplish? Is it about community awareness, community development? Is it about brand awareness? Is it about IRL purchases? And how do we make those measurements to justify the level of investments? I think we're starting to see a bit more sophistication, but I will say we are at a very, very, very early stage of brands thinking about that. We are still, in my mind, in the kind of rushing into having something live, still in the stage of let's just get a Facebook page live. I think that's where we are now. And I think it's going to take a bit of time until brands really are starting to ask themselves the difficult questions. And there's going to be time for collaborators, companies like mine, like Super Social, who are able to provide those deeper level insights of here is why what you're doing is going to actually move the needle for your KPIs.
And indeed, I think the companies that are going to really be successful, that you're 100% correct. Like, we're in the test and experimentation phase, and there's going to be a lot of money coming from brands and a lot of excitement and what have you, and a lot that can be tapped into. But we're going to go to that next phase quickly. So it's not today, but the smart companies, the smart technologies that are going to be built, they need to have this framework in mind if they are intending, and again, you don't have to partner with brands, of course, but like, if the vision, if the technology you're making is in some way predicated or partially subsidized by corporate alliances or sponsorships or advertisements or whatever, making sure you're thinking through, okay, at some point someone's going to ask me what I'm getting out of it, and preparing for that, I guarantee you will save yourself a world of pain relative to perhaps 3, 4, 5 years from your initial build, when that isn't part of something that you're kind of like building into the infrastructure and skeleton of whatever tech or platform or what have you you're putting together. Which again, speaking from experience, Facebook, Twitter, other such companies, these were all things they kind of had to learn that lesson. Let's get ahead of it this time.
And maybe just to wrap up, the place where you spend a lot of your time now at Activision is around esports. And, they've built a fantastic esports business, Overwatch League. I remember going to the finals at the Barclays Arena in New York a couple of years ago before COVID, and that was crazy. But I think I talked to investors, and it's like, yes, they're filling up full-size American arenas, and people are like, really? I was like, yeah. But obviously, branding, marketing plays a big role there. And I think but I also think esports has played a really big role in gaming. You know, I talked with Will Hershey about this on a webinar a while back, and you know, I always ascribe to kind of like the Newzoo esports view, which is like, okay, it's like marketing revenue and brand revenue and tickets and everything. And he's like, well, take a step back, because there's so many of these games that wouldn't be where they are without esports. Like League of Legends wouldn't be what it is without esports. Overwatch got to where it was because, you know, in part because of the esports, you know, and so when you think about esports from that realm, it's so much bigger than just ticket sales. Do you have any thoughts about what esports looks like in the metaverse, you know, as the metaverse takes shape?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the eye openers for a lot of brands that, you know, esports like Metaverse or what have you, something that like had a lot of hype behind it, a lot of people were excited and whatnot. It kind of died out a little bit in recent years, maybe because like, oh, now we're thinking about Metaverse or what have you. But of course, like, you know, it's a challenging industry. It's a tough industry overall. And I think, you know, again, there's been recent announcements about layoffs and what have you. And, you know, again, my shout out to folks would be like, if you want people that know a lot about gaming and are deeply passionate about the sector, like find those folks that got laid off and get them jobs and get them into your orgs. Because I think, trust me, you'll thank me for it later. But, you know, what I think it kind of opened eyes on for folks is that, you know, there's this concept of competitive entertainment that can be played at a high level devoid of physical interaction. So obviously for something like the COVID-19 pandemic, that was great. Not to say that there weren't any logistical problems that had to be overcome in terms of like, how do you make it equitable with like pings and latency and things like that? Because again, those things matter a lot at the professional level, that you want to make sure that that playing field's even. But I think starting to think through the concept of sport without physical attendees, sport that can be viewed virtually. Of course, it's really easiest for us to think through how like esports viewership could jive quite naturalistically in virtual worlds, right? Because literally they're played in virtual worlds of some way or another. So like that's super easy to think about and see, and you know, again, even in itself something to really kind of dive into. But then also, how does that influence our thinking of physical sport applied to something like the metaverse, right? How do our expectations for spectatorship change when we're not looking at a flat screen? And that kind of gets interesting too, right? Like, is there technology that can be put together that shows like a real humans player's perspective and what have you? So it's one of these things where like, sure, on the one hand, esports was like on television in its early days and crashed because like it just didn't fit with how individuals thought they should view it. Advent of Twitch and other such streaming platforms, it took off again, right? Because that was a lot more naturalistic. And I think there's a real opportunity in the metaverse that like that can be taken to the next level to really kind of push esports and the fandom behind it. But then while we're doing that, I think that's important, we should also think about, okay, how does that lens of esports also potentially influence our thinking through traditional sports and how we might translate that, not from a flat screen, but for something that's more immersive or what have you. And I think that in and of itself is just as interesting in terms of the opportunities that can provide. But again, all lessons that we can learn from that broader gaming world, that broader esports world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, if we take live entertainment as a whole bucket, right, you know, concerts, live sports, esports, having that viewing experience, people talk about the emotional aspect of concerts, and that's such a big part of what makes it great is being with people. It goes back to, we talked about this being driven by human interactions. If you can recreate that for people who physically can't be in person, you know, and you know, I look at Unity and you know, they hired Peter Moore from Liverpool a couple of years ago to build a sports business. You know, they're thinking about this. How can I sit inside the Barclays Arena and watch the Nets even though I'm in Florida?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Or be in the arena. Or again, the concerts are interesting. Like, where else can you like literally slide down a 40-story version of Ariana Grande? Like, again, it rethinks like what we believe to be a given experience as something that's potentially more interesting and interactive. And again, concerts are there. Various experimental marketing is getting there. I think sport is going to get there. Esports is already kind of there. I think what we're seeing is just like an overall shift, not just in technology per se, but how we think about human experience, spectatorship, involvement in technology more broadly.
This is a great place to wrap up. Human experience of the internet is the next frontier, as we like to say. So, Jonathan, thank you again so much for joining us. And again, congratulations on the book. Everyone go check it out. We'll add it as a link to our Substack post about the podcast. And thank you so much. It's been illuminating. Both Matthew and I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you guys so much. Super interesting conversation.
Thanks.